All right, we left off at the Berlin airlift because what happened once again at the Berlin airlift, or what happened with the Berlin blockade? Once again, the Soviets trying to get the West, democratic nations out of their territory, out of Berlin. They said you can't get supplies to them. It's kind of like owning a house. And in order to get to your house, you have to cross the street. But the problem is that you don't own the street, and somebody that hates you owns the street and says, "Yeah, you can get to your house. You just can't put your feet on my road." And so it kind of put the Allies in a bind. And so what they decided to do, we talked about this in class already, but they decided to airlift their supplies in, refusing to get out. 2.5 million people cut off from supplies, not wanting to start a war, but also not wanting to give in to the demands of a crazy dictator. Cough, Adolf Hitler. Uh, they learned from that, and so they are going to just airlift supplies in. And they did that for 10 months, and eventually the Soviet blockade is going to be lifted, and they're going to eventually allow them to send supplies through rail and truck. But the United States refused, and the West refused to allow Berlin to fall into the hands of the Soviets. And so that was really the first major conflict where there's going to be a lot of these situations where it's really close to creating problems. It's right there, like, oh, this could turn out really bad. We could go to World War III. Oh, thank goodness it doesn't. There's a lot of these, but that's really the first. So once again, there's just some pictures of the Berlin airlift. Fly them in and send them back. And so what happened then is that you have Germany is going to get, after kind of this incident we talked about, Germany is going to be split into two sides. West Germany is going to be created out of the Allied powers, and then the Soviets it got cut off there. But the Soviets are obviously going to create East Germany. It's up here. And it shows it up there, kind of what East and West Germany, and it's going to stay divided throughout the Cold War. The arms race. With the United States showing its nuclear capability at the end of World War II, the Soviet Union was scrambling to develop technology to ensure that the U.S. doesn't launch a nuclear weapon at them. And so what the Soviet Union did is they were able to explode their first nuke in 1949. And this is going to begin a race where these countries immediately began just building more nuclear weapons. Because once the Soviets had nuclear capability, everybody was like, whoa, holy cow, we've got to up our game now, and let's make our nukes more powerful. Let's make them more abundant. And so if they decide to attack us, we'll have more nukes to attack them. And the Soviet Union's thinking the same thing. Like, well, they've got more powerful nukes. We've got to build more powerful nukes. And so that once the Soviet Union exploded their first nuclear weapon, that set on an arms race that really, to be honest, got out of control. They were racing to acquire more and more nuclear weapons, developing deadlier bombs. There it is. That's the word I'm looking for. And what they did is they believed that having a stockpile of nuclear weapons, they believed that the other country would not dare to attack them because they would simply just return the favor, and that's called a nuclear deterrent. All right, and so the logic was is that, hey, we're going to build up these nukes and not use them, but the other side knows that we have them, and so if they even think about attacking us, they know that we'll destroy them with all our nuclear weapons. And so that was the mentality back then. Like, if we can just have a lot of nukes and have them spread out all over the world, the Soviet Union wouldn't be able to hit them all. They launch on us, we launch on them, and we just destroy each other. So if that's the game they want to play, awesome. Soviet Union's thinking the same thing we are. And so nothing makes everybody feel safe by sleeping on a pile of nuclear weapons. Uh, we'll go over some of the tension, obviously, that created. Miss Perkins used to work here. She talked about how they used to do drills. She lived off the coast or off in the West Coast in California during this time. I don't mean to date her or anything like that, but to give her an idea of her age. But she doesn't work in this building anymore, so I guess it's all right. But she used to say they used to practice these drills. They used to practice what to do in the event of a nuclear attack. A lot of it didn't really make much sense. Like, hey, hide under your desk. But anyway, but there were I mean, this was really a very real threat. This isn't something we're just making up. I mean, there's a Dayton evacuation plan. We might go over that in class. I can show you that, like a pamphlet, what to do if the siren goes off. That was in Dayton, Ohio. So once again, it just keep getting more and more powerful, deadlier. ICBMs, these intercontinental ballistic missiles, now instead of being on a plane, they can launch them great distances. Pretty soon, the bombs that they're going to create are going to make the atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and make it look like a little pea shooter. These bombs are going to become more and more deadlier. The hydrogen bomb is going to become much more powerful than the atomic bomb. Sputnik. You might think that's not that big a deal. The Sputnik was a satellite, and this always gets confusing because we talk about satellite states, but just with the technology, it was an actual physical satellite, kind of looked like that right there, that orbited the Earth. It was the first ever satellite to put into orbit. It was created by the Soviets. And once again, the significance of that is it created fears amongst the American public, like, hey, what else can they do? If they are able to put something in orbit, could they attach weapons to it? Could they spy on us? What else are they capable of? And so it was always kind of believed, and the reason, once again, this was such a big deal, is it was always kind of a belief in America, like, oh, we exploded the atomic bomb first. We're further along. Our capabilities are more advanced than the Soviet Union because we were always kind of a step ahead. They were playing catch up. Well, now it seems like that's not the case with the Sputnik. It looks like now we're behind. And that's going to start things like the space race, and that's going to start all sorts of competition once again with the Soviet Union. Other things happen, like a military alliance is going to form. And one of the military alliances is actually still true to this day as NATO. It stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. You're not going to have to memorize all the countries that are there. Basically, it was Western Europe. Let me see if I can zoom in on that. Pretty much all of Western Europe. You can see kind of right where that Iron Curtain in Europe is split right there, that Iron Curtain. Pretty much those countries, got Turkey, Greece, you got a bunch of other countries thrown in there, United States, Canada, etc. It's a military alliance. All powers agreed to provide mutual help if anyone was attacked. And really what the United States planned on this when this was created, not only in the United States, but the West, like it was a message to the Soviet Union. Like, don't try to spread communism to any of these other countries. Because if you do, we're going to be, it's just like picking a fight with the United States. We're going to have problems with you. And so this was a way to prevent the spread of communism. The other rival alliance that was created was the Warsaw Pact. Now, this was created in response to NATO, and you can see, obviously, it's pretty much the opposite of NATO. It's the Soviet Union and their satellite nations. You got a little crack in there. I think that's Yugoslavia right there, but Albania will join later. But you see, it's pretty much, that's pretty much it. And so it's really not unlike, if you guys remember, back to World War I when they had the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. And really all it would take is a spark to start World War I. We're kind of in that situation again, where you've got one side of the world. Now, this is even more significant because the Triple Alliance were the three main powers in Europe on one side and then three main powers in Europe on the other side. In World War I. This is even more significant because it really is, once again, you see all the countries involved. It's much larger, on a much larger scale. But either way, if one country would go to war, all of a sudden the world could be at war again just based on these alliance systems. Once again, the alliance systems are meant to pose as collective security, to where if one member's attacked, it's like an attack on all of them. But in reality, what can happen is if you got two alliances like this, is that you can get an entire world at war pretty easily. And we saw that in World War I with the Triple Alliance and Triple Entente. And so the United States, once again, their whole goal with the Truman Doctrine was to stop the spread of communism. They're going to fight several wars, and there's going to be a lot of things that happen to try to stem that spread, stop that spread. Communism is going to come to China, though, in 1949. There'd been this long-standing kind of civil war been going on for a couple decades with the communists in China. Well, eventually they're going to seize control. And communism is going to come to China, and this is going to strengthen fears about the spread of communism. All right, this is a big deal because Japan is, whoops, dropped my pen. This is going to strengthen U.S. fears about the spread of communism when China becomes communist. Because what they're going to do, because now the United States is going to fear, well, that's the largest, most influential country in Asia. They could really influence a lot of countries and help a lot of countries to become communist. So we're going to get in a couple of wars that are in Asia simply because, they're fearing that communism will just catch like wildfire and that all these countries will become. The first one we're going to get into is going to be with the Korean War. Korea previously belonged to Japan. Japan had invaded it. And so after World War II, what they did is they took it and they divided it. They took the north, and then they took the north and gave it to the Soviets, and the south they gave to the United States. And so the north obviously became communist, the south became democratic. And with the approval of Joseph Stalin, what happened with that communist regime in the north, he wanted to unify all of Korea. And so he got permission from Joseph Stalin, got some weapons from him, and they invaded the south. And they got really far to almost taking over the south. Then the United States enters. So it's a major test for the UN and the United States to prevent the spread of communism. How's the UN going to handle it? Well, they respond, and they are going to take over and win this war. With North Korea, they get pretty deep. If they get pretty far into their territory, eventually they're going to push really to the southern edge of the peninsula here, and it's going to be close to a defeat, but then the United States is going to have refreshment troops, and they're going to end up driving them back. After 3 years of fighting, there is no final victory, and an armistice is signed, agreeing that they basically just meaning we're going to stop fighting. South Korea still remains our ally today, democratic, and if you know anything about North Korea, they hate our guts. And it's because of our involvement in this war. We'll read in class, we'll read some like children's books and things where they talk about how the Americans are the enemy and how just their pure hatred toward America. A lot of it stems from us aiding South Korea in the Korean War. But they hate our guts today. With the Korean War, once again, confirming, with the Korean War, confirmed U.S. fears of aggressive communist takeover. And so they signed a bunch of other treaties. Like, okay, if these smaller countries, not even necessarily the Soviet Union, once again, the Soviet Union had influence in that war, but if these smaller countries are going to invade, we need to let them know, hey, if you invade any of these countries, U.S., Great Britain, France, Pakistan, Thailand, Philippines, Australia, if you go into any of these countries, Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, if you go into any of these countries, you're going to be picking a fight with the United States. And so once again, all these smaller alliances are going to be formed to try to stop the spread of communism. I'm going to break this up, but I'm just going to finish it. That way we don't have to split it anymore. Joseph Stalin's going to die. And the next person that's going to come into power is going to be Nikita Khrushchev. Now, he's going to be the next leader of the Soviet Union. Now, he's going to play a pretty integral part. He's going to have his hands on a lot of things. He's not as maniacal as Stalin, but really, who is? That guy is psycho. But still, he's still very aggressive, still willing to pick up the battle and go against the United States. A couple things that he's going to do. One of them, or that he's going to orchestrate or help, kind of have his hands on. One of them is going to be the Berlin Wall. All right, now this is going to be a problem. You're going to have to know about the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall was East Germany became communist, and it was poverty-stricken. That they were struggling. Their economy was struggling. Meanwhile, the West Germany and West Berlin, for that matter, their economies were thriving. They received help from the Marshall Plan. They got money to help rebuild. East Germany did not. And so since Berlin, once again, if I scroll all the way up, sorry, I'm going to make you dizzy. If I scroll all the way up, once again, Berlin is smack dab in the middle of East Germany. Smack dab in the middle. And so West Berlin is thriving. And so what's going to happen is you're going to have a lot of people who are going to be like, well, if I'm starving here. Why don't I just move here and go here? I'm really close to this area. I'll just move to the Allies side of West Berlin. It's prosperous. Let's do that. That makes sense. Sorry. And so what they did in order to stop the flow of that is they built the Berlin Wall. Now this actually is a physical structure. I talked about the Iron Curtain in the last notes. This is an actual physical structure. The Iron Curtain actually wasn't a physical structure, but they did that to stop people from going in, leaving East Germany and fleeing to West Berlin. So trying to pick up where I left off, once again, this Berlin Wall, this gigantic wall is created around the city of Berlin. It's an actual physical structure. It was meant to stem the amount of refugees that fled from East Germany from East Germany and East Berlin into West Berlin. And it really became a symbol of the Cold War to represent the hostility between the two sides. And it was more than, once again, just a wall. I mean, people died trying to cross it. It had watchtowers. It had, everything you'd expect with a communist nation, where they rule with iron fists, machine guns, minefields, people. Like I said, it wasn't just like, hey, let's put up a little plaster wall. People died trying to cross it. And so it signified just the hostilities between the two sides. And when it was torn down, it kind of signified an end of those hostilities. And then going through quickly, what happened right in our backyard is Fidel Castro is going to come into power. He is a communist dictator of Cuba, and he's going to come into power in 1959. And this is really a problem because the United States is going to have a great fear having a communist in their backyard. And so not only did communism spread, in Asia and all this stuff, now we've got a communism 90 miles away from us that is allies with the Soviet Union. And so they feared this. And so what they tried to do is they tried to set up a plan where they could train these exiled Cuban fighters, basically these resistance fighters that had been exiled, kicked out of Cuba. The United States said, oh, we'll train them, we'll get them weapons, we'll do all this stuff, and they can lead the revolution from within Cuba. Once they land, people will start to be like, oh, we can get rid of Castro, let's join this rebellion. And they thought that they could start a revolt by sending ex-Cuban fighters who were fighting Castro back in, they retrain them, give them new weapons, and that was the logic there with the Bay of Pigs. All right, and it's called the Bay of Pigs, obviously, because right there, that's where they were going to launch the invasion from. And so when that happened, they had armed these Cuban exiled fighters once again, and it also not only were they hoping that, but it also gives the United States some deniability. If you got a bunch of Americans that are shot dead in Cuba, that looks bad to the world. But if a bunch of Cubans are arrested and round up fighting other Cubans, the United States can have some deniability there. And so that's why it talks about, like, why do you think they would send Cubans rather than Americans? But this was a complete disaster. It was really embarrassing. The invasion began on Sunday, and by Wednesday they were already surrendering. They really did not anticipate. They thought that more people in Cuba would be outraged and willing to fight. And so they thought, they said the Cuban armed forces are stronger than they thought. The popular response, meaning thinking people that would join the cause, is weaker than we thought. And our tactical position where we dropped them off is worse than what we thought. It's feebler than what we thought. So there really wasn't anything good. And the United States didn't, after they sent them back, they didn't really offer any other support. So it really didn't have much of a chance to succeed. But it kind of ticked off Castro. And so he's like, all right, fine. You want to do that? That's cool. I'm going to meet up with my boy Khrushchev. All right. And that's going to begin the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1962, Khrushchev began to place nuclear missiles in Cuba. And these missiles were meant to counteract nuclear missiles that were in Turkey at the time, which is right next to the Soviet Union. This is usually considered the height of the Cold War. Very stressful in both sides. It's the closest the world has really come to nuclear warfare. One mistake could have resulted as the end of the world as we know it, creating a much different outcome. It was really a test to see who would blink first, and in the blink of an eye, 80 million Americans could be dead. It could reach any city in America, and it could really threaten our, obviously being launched that close from Cuba. Once again, going back up to the chart, it's 90 miles away from Florida. Being that close, it would really affect our response time too when if they were to launch a nuclear missile. And so they could wipe us out, and we would then in turn wipe them out pretty quickly. So this was really bad. And so there were all these plans being drawn up. What should we do? When they found out about the nukes, they weren't yet operational. They weren't going to be operational for a couple weeks. Plans were drawn up to invade Cuba, to launch an aerial assault over Cuba. All of these things could have definitely led to World War III. Could have led to a much more significant outcome if the United States decided to attack Cuba. But what they ended up doing, they ended up setting up a blockade, not allowing ships to go in. And Soviet ships got right up to that blockade line. And if they ran that blockade line, that might lead to military intervention. And so these Soviet ships with nuclear weapons are making their way toward Cuba. The United States has a line of ships being like, you're not going to get through here. And as the Soviet ships are getting close to crossing that blockade, the Soviet leader decides, hey, we can work something out. They agreed to remove the missiles if America would lift the boycott and promise not to invade Cuba. Then they must remove the missiles in Turkey. The U.S. agreed, but they said we're only going to do it if we can remove them 6 months later. Kind of after the fact, because they didn't want to seem like they just got bullied into something, which they kind of did. But they're like, we'll remove them, but we're going to remove them on our terms, on our time. So you get those missiles out of Cuba, and once those missiles are out, then 6 months later, we'll take our missiles out of Cuba, or out of Turkey, excuse me. And so that's what they agreed upon. Once again, it would make the U.S. look less like they were giving in, because nobody obviously, because every time the Soviet Union wanted the U.S. to do something, they could be like, okay, fine, well, let's put missiles back in Cuba, and they could keep threatening the United States with that. And so the U.S. said, we'll do it. We'll do it on our time, though. We agreed, and nuclear war was averted. But the Cuban Missile Crisis really was a very intense time, with their nukes pointing at us from a very close distance, and our nukes pointing at them at a very close distance. And really, it was a matter of if somebody ran the blockade, or if something would have happened. Who knows if Kennedy would have listened to some of his military advisors who were recommending, let's fry the island, let's just destroy the nukes before they become operational, let's just bomb the crap out of it. If he would have listened to that, who knows? I mean, who knows what would have happened? But I mean, that we were one decision away from possibly an all-out nuclear war, which is crazy to think about. But that's what the Cuban Missile Crisis was. They put nukes in Cuba before they became operational. They ended up solving the problem before it became too intense. So a little bit longer, not bad.